Today I'm going to be attempting to replace the rear wheel bearings on a 2007 Toyota Tundra. I began by removing the wheel and then moved around to the back side to take off the ABS sensor. That's what the sensor looks like right here. It is fairly difficult to get off. It has an outer shield that you need to remove first, and I'll open that up and show you a little more detail if I can and zoom in. And then you need to remove the actual sensor from the bearing assembly by pressing a clip and pulling it off like this. This is what that outer protector looks like for that wheel sensor. It has a clip on one side and two clips on the other side that you need to pry off gently with a small screwdriver. Open this clamshell up and then you can get to the inner connector for the wheel sensor. Once you've got that removed, you just want to go ahead and tuck that out of the way, and we can begin to work on the other pieces that we need to complete and take apart in order to get to the wheel bearing. You'll also want to remove the brake line from this bracket holder that's on the back of the backing plate. You can choose to take the brake line apart at its junction. Mine's kind of corroded and rusty, and so I've decided not to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and do what I've seen some other people on the web do, which is cut a notch in this bracket. So I get that, cut a notch in this bracket right here so I can slip the brake line through it without having to take it apart. That prevents me from damaging the line, and hopefully will prevent me from having to bleed the brakes later as well. So I'm going to get a cut-off wheel, and we'll get that done, and then I'll be right back. So the cuts through that holder bracket are complete. It was fairly easy to do. Just took a couple of minutes or so, and as you can see, it will allow me to easily remove the brake line from that mounting position, so that when we go to slide this axle and hub and bearing assembly off the axle tube, we won't have that in the way any longer. I did forget to mention, when you're going to remove your brake line from the bracket on the back of the backing plate, there is a spring-loaded clip, a tensioner clip, that slips on over the brake line like so. You'll need to just use a screwdriver to pry that out, and then once you get it started, you can grab it with a pair of pliers and slip it right off. So they'll have to remove that as well. Now we'll go ahead and get started on the rest of the brake disassembly. The next thing we're going to want to do is to adjust the parking brake shoes so that we can get this disc rotor off. Inside this rotor is actually a drum brake, and that's what the emergency brake is for this particular model of Toyota. In order to do that, we have to modify this adjuster screw. We'll bring those brake shoes in closer together so they're not rubbing on the disc, and that way when we go to pull the rotor off, it will come off easier. I've gone ahead and placed the truck in neutral so that I can rotate the wheel slightly, and what I want to do is try to position this rubber plug that you can remove with a screwdriver directly over the star adjuster wheel inside to allow me to adjust my rear brake shoes. It's kind of hard to show on camera, so I'm not really going to be able to try and do that, but you look through this hole, and what you're looking for is a piece that looks like this. This is the star adjuster I'm telling you about. What you do is you can put a screwdriver in there and then ratchet this thing down. And the more you ratchet it down, the closer in your shoes will come away from the inside of the drum, so you can get the disc rotor off easier. I'd recommend on mine, I've already changed these once. The last time I did it, there was a lot of corrosion on the inside of the rotor where the brake drum was, and even though I had adjusted it down significantly, the brake pad still got hung up when I was trying to remove the rotor. So I'd recommend you move it all the way down until it stops. That will give you the best chance of getting your rotor off without much trouble. You've adjusted your parking brake shoes all the way in. What you'll need to do next is remove the caliper right here. There's two bolts on the back side that we'll need to remove. I'll get a light here and see if I can get it on camera for you. There's one here and another one down here. These are 17mm bolts, and I'm going to go ahead and air impact wrench, take them off now. Now that we've got our caliper bolts removed, we want to go ahead and remove the caliper, and I'm going to hang it with a piece of wire and support it so that it doesn't hang from the brake line hoses. You never want to allow your caliper to hang from the hoses. You could damage the hose that way and end up causing yourself more headaches than it's worth. So I'm going to remove the caliper. We're going to hang it up out of the way with a piece of wire, stiff wire. and support it. And that'll be out of our way then for the rest of the repair. We're going to remove our brake pads as well. Take a bit of effort to get those out. Not a huge deal. Use a screwdriver to gently pry them out. And then we'll be removing the caliper bracket as well so that we can get the disc rotor off. Caliper bracket bolts are mounted on the back side of the wheel assembly. There's 2 bolts that hold it in. There's one here and another one down here. They're both 17 millimeters as well. And we'll quick zip those off and then we can remove the caliper bracket. Go on ahead and remove the caliper bracket as well. And assuming that you've adjusted your star adjuster for the brake shoes all the way in to pull them as far in as you can get them, a few good whacks with a hammer around the outside of the rotor should free it up and you should be able to pull it off without much trouble. In the event that it doesn't come off, you can use 2 10 millimeter bolts with an 8.25 thread pitch, and you can put them into these pre-tapped holes here and here on your disc. All you do is thread these bolts in, and then in an alternating fashion tighten one then the other, and they will force the rotor, the disc rotor, off of the hub back towards you. So again, you put these in, you just go ahead and tighten them down. You do tighten one bolt, then alternate and go to the other, and just keep going back and forth between the two, and it will force that disc off of the hub and back out towards you. Now that we've got our disc rotor off, I can show you the inside portion of it that I told you looked like a drum brake setup, which is what your emergency brake rides in. You maybe get a little clearer picture of that star adjuster wheel as well. Right there it is. Like I said, this is that star adjuster inside your brake drum, your emergency brake drum. That's the one you wanted to turn to pull your brake shoes in to make it easier to get your rotor off. The reason I told you that you wanted to adjust your brake pads in as far as you could is because where I live in the Rust Belt, my old ones, this one's relatively new, but my old ones rusted right around this outer lip right here and created a wedge that even with the adjusters all the way in still snagged the brake pads and made it difficult to get the rotor off. So hopefully you won't have that problem, and if you adjust them as far in as you can get them, it should come off relatively easily. Now we've covered those things, we can set about removing the brake shoes themselves. In order to do that, there are 2 springs we need to remove. There's one here, there's another one down here right above the brake adjuster, and then we'll need to remove these spring tensioner clips that hold the brake shoes themselves in. There's 2 of those, one on each side. And finally we'll need to remove the emergency brake tensioner. So I'm going to go ahead and use a pair of needle nose vice grips to remove those springs, remove these stays here. We'll remove the star wheel adjuster as well, and then finally we'll remove the emergency brake cable tensioner arm. I should have mentioned earlier, if you've never seen this type of a clip or a spring before, basically this pin slides through the backing plate. There's holes, pre-drilled holes. It slides up through the backing plate towards the front of the brake assembly, and then you press your spring down and compress it against the brake shoe. Oops. And this pin will go through and then turns and locks in place. So all you need to do with your pliers or your tool, they do a special tool for this as well, is just go ahead and press that against the brake pad and twist it so that that pin can come free and come out and release your brake shoe. Now that we've got our brake shoes off, it's time to remove the emergency brake lever arm. And what you do is you pull that out, and then you can see inside there where the cable, I hope you can see it, it's kind of right here, is just kind of threaded through a couple of arms. And what you need to do is rotate that out and this clip will come off and leave your emergency brake cable exposed. Then we can remove that from the back side next. Next we're going to remove the emergency brake cable. It's bolted onto the backing plate right here. It's a single 10mm nut bolt. We'll go ahead and take that off, and then we'll remove this from the backing plate. Now we've got our emergency brake cable disconnected from the backing plate. The next thing I'm going to do is to remove the wheel sensor from the backing plate as well. Down here, right beneath the connector part, is a 10mm bolt. We want to remove that, and then the whole sensor should come out of the bearing carrier assembly. So we'll go ahead and get that off quick, and then we'll move on to the next step. Well, got the wheel speed sensor out easy enough, I guess. Unfortunately, I believe I broke it when I was taking it out. You can see right here where it kind of broke off, and there's a piece. I went ahead and pulled the 4 nuts that held the bearing carrier assembly and the axle out, and you can see there's a piece of the sensor still stuck in there. I think if I had to do it over again, what I would do is wait to remove the speed sensor until after I got the whole assembly out, and then I could use a screwdriver to help pry this out, which is what I'm going to end up doing to have to remove that piece that's stuck in there. But I think I'd be less likely to break it. That thing was really corroded around it, and it's a pretty snug fit. I don't know how you get it out of there just wiggling it back and forth, but the screwdriver method like this I think would work pretty well. So that's what I'm going to remove this broken piece, and I'll have to go to the parts store to get another wheel speed sensor. Unfortunately, I'm sure that's going to be very expensive. So I've gotten the axle shaft and the bearings and the backing plates back from the machine shop, but I want to take this opportunity to show you my old backing plates and why I replaced them. So you can see it's rusted through right along here. This is the driver's side. It's rusted all the way up to here and all the way through here, and it's in pretty bad shape. You can also see on this side, because the bearing had let go, the rotor rubbed on the inside of the backing plate right here and actually ground all the way through. Passenger side isn't really much better. Take a look at that one. So you can see this one has a hole all the way through it right here, and again the rotor cut into the backing plate all the way along this edge here and again down here. So both these were in pretty rough shape. I decided to go ahead and replace them, and I think I'll be glad that I did. Now that we've got the bearing hub assembly and axle out, I'm going to go ahead and clean up these edges here with a Scotch-Brite pad and prepare it for reinstallation after I get the new bearings pressed in. Moved over to the passenger side to use this as an addendum to the first part of the video I did. I've got the ABS sensor wire disconnected, and what I'm going to do rather than trying to remove this connection right here, I'm going to go ahead and leave that in. We can actually leave that in until we remove the axle and bearing assembly, and then we can get at it from the inside to push that out rather than trying to pull it out and break that connector again. It did turn out to be pretty expensive. The cheapest one I could find was $170. So be cautious and probably use this technique rather than the one I showed you first. Okay, now that we've got our rear brake assembly disassembled, we've removed the parking brake cable, we've disconnected the ABS wheel sensor, and our brake line's out of the way. So now it's time to go ahead and remove the 4 bolts that contain the connectors that hold the bearing assembly and everything to the axle tube. So there's 4 bolts. There's one here, one down here, one over on this side right here at the top, and another one down here at the bottom. They're all 17 millimeters. We're going to go ahead and take those off real quick, and then we'll be able to gently tap on one of these bolts and drive this axle shaft and wheel assembly off the axle tube. We've gotten all 4 bolts removed that hold the bearing housing and assembly to the axle tube. So Now what we got to do is just go ahead and gently give these a little bit of a tap to separate it from the axle housing itself. And again, you don't have to be real hand-fisted with this, just give it a nice gentle tap and it'll start to separate. Now that we've got this kind of tapped out and started, what you can do is pull the remainder of this wheel assembly out from the axle tube. You might want to put a rag on the floor or a catch pan or something, as some differential fluid probably will leak out onto the floor. So once you get it started, you just carefully pull this out. And don't forget that there's an O-ring attached right here. You want to remember as well. Be careful if you're going to reuse it and save it. I personally would buy a new one. They're only about $4, even from the Toyota dealer. So make sure you get that off of there as well. Now that we've got the wheel bearing assembly and the axle shaft pulled out of the vehicle, we want to go ahead and remove this ABS sensor here that I talked about earlier. Again, they're very fragile and you want to be careful, and they're very expensive to replace. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this 10mm nut right here, and then we're going to use a screwdriver to gently pry from the inside here out and push this stem and the whole sensor out of the bearing assembly. Hopefully that'll be a little more successful than the other way we did it, where we broke the sensor. I'm glad to report that using the screwdriver method to pry this from the inside and push it out seemed to work just fine. It took a little bit of effort, but was able to go slowly and gently, and it popped right out. No breakage, so better to wait to take this part off until after you remove the axle from the tube. Alright, well, we've got most of the disassembly already completed. There's one final piece we need to do, and I'm going to be replacing these wheel seals, which reside right inside the axle tube here. They do make a seal puller. Unfortunately, I don't have one. A lot of people will just use a big flat blade screwdriver to stick in there and wedge this out. I'm going to use this particular tool. It's like a pry bar, but it's got a hook on the end. I'm going to slide that inside here and remove this steel. And there it is. This particular one actually had failed and caused some leakage inside there. But they're about $10, $12 a piece. A lot of people say you can reuse these. I certainly wouldn't. I'll leave it up to you. I'll be replacing these. Just a quick note about reassembly. This is a view down inside that axle tube. You'll notice that partway down the tube there is like a metal piece with some tabs on it. That's, I believe, an oil baffle to prevent the differential oil from sloshing all the way out to the end. You want to make sure when you reinstall your axle to keep it centered within the axle tube so that you don't catch that and dislodge that and knock that loose. That will cause you a bunch of other problems. So be really careful when you're putting the axle back in, and keep it centered as best you can while you get it threaded into those splines in the differential.